Welcome to this edition of Inside the Human School, where we each share some background about how the Human School came about, as well as something that resonated with us regarding the compass points and mind shifts. We also hope to share a little bit about how we work behind the scenes as learners too. I'm Rachel.
I'm Randy.
And I'm Chad.
As we engage in the podcast this week, we want to share a little bit about our growth and processes, and then share what we're reading, exploring, or learning about. So this week's Inside the Human School question is, where did the idea of a compass point come from? So Chad, what do you remember?
So I know that Randy had all these really cool and interesting ideas around this work, right? So the mind shifts as a whole, or different kind of buckets, for lack of a better word, that eventually became the compass points. And when he started to bring into these conversations, and we were brainstorming and spitballing together, we talked about this frustration we have, where a lot of people will present ideas as plug and play or checklists, or here, just take this easy, simple thing and you do it in your school and your context, and it will be great. And we know from our experience and from our values and beliefs, that's just not how change evolves and grows. And we get talking about kind of different metaphors and different ideas about what it would look like for people to connect to it. And we got talking about tools. And being a social studies teacher, I start to think about things like maps and how people use maps to navigate the world, and that there's no defined beginning and end. It's just you decide where you want to go and you navigate the map. And then we got thinking about, well, what are the tools that come into play? And a compass was one of those tools that allowed us to orient ourselves within our world and within our context. And then when you started to look at the buckets, which became the compass points, it became pretty obvious to us that we were onto something that we thought might resonate with people. That wasn't something you could just simply bring into your school or your school system and say, if I do these 4 things, all of a sudden everything's going to change, because that's not what we're really doing here. So I don't know, Randy, feel free to expand upon that thinking, but that's kind of how it started.
Yeah. And I think I would like the listeners to walk away from this conversation with one really important idea that I think we've tried to reiterate numerous times, especially in the Inventor Compass Point, and that is that creative work is iterative. I don't care if you're writing a blog post or you're building a plan to transform something about your school. It is never going to be right the first time. And you may even see as these, and not you may, you will see as we start to produce content over the course of at least the next year here at the Human School, that this idea of the compass and the mind shifts, they're going to evolve. And you'll notice on the PDF, the graphic, it says version 1.0 with the intention that there's going to be a 2.0 and a 3.0 and a 4.6 and 7 and whatever. And I think that is something that is so not compatible with this sort of left brain way of thinking. And that is that we got to get it right the first time. Like this isn't like, throwing a strike where you got to get it right there to get the thumbs up and get the strike. This is an iterative process. So when you are inventing things, like when we were inventing this idea of the Human School, you throw ideas out there and you find like minds, like Chad and Rachel here, to think with you about these ideas, and you create these iterations as you go along. And now we've thrown this idea out there and we want to get more like minds around it to create more and future iterations. And who knows, maybe the compass will evolve into some other sort of metaphor. But we just felt like, as Chad had described, that the compass was a really good place to start and something that made sense to us and hopefully to other people.
And Randy, the one thing I would add to that is not only with iteration, but the idea of the learning happens in the messy middle, right? And so another thing that I think is core to our work is we're going to learn in public, and we're not going to make sure, we want things to look good, but we're not going to wait until something's perfect to release it. We want to be really intentional about the learning that happens between the start and the end. And that's another thing that we kind of see doesn't seem to happen a lot in the space. There ends up being this like beautiful polished product and not a whole lot of conversation about how you got there. And so I'm hoping that people will come along for the journey and they'll grow and understand that the learning happens. I call it all the time, the learning happens in the messy middle. That's where it is. It's not the end. It's the journey. So I just wanted to kind of share that as well.
Absolutely. And so speaking of learning, we're going to talk a little bit about what we were curious about this week, or what we were learning this week. So one of the things that I was focused on is reading Adam Grant's Think Again, which I know I'm a little behind for the two of you because you read it when it came out. But I'm actually listening to the audiobook version, which I enjoy. And one of the things that I was listening to this week was about this idea of being agreeable and disagreeable. And he really split disagreeable in a way that resonated with me. I know that I'm an agreeable person. And he talked about being a people pleaser who is able to be disagreeable around ideas, but not around interpersonal relationships. And that really clicked for me, because I don't have a problem being disagreeable around ideas or philosophies or creation of product. And because the intention is to be disagreeable around, like, for the purpose of improvement. And it comes from a place of support and care for something to be better. And so I just really enjoyed that. And I still really want to play with what that looks like in my work, and what that looks like the three of us are friends, in life, not just through this job. And so, finding those places where I can be disagreeable with a purpose, in trying to improve, and then how to help support others who struggle to be disagreeable when we talk about our objector mindset, who are afraid to kind of rock the boat, or, take those steps towards encouragement of, what about this? Or have we thought about that? So thinking about kind of wrapping my head more around that, and then thinking about how to support others through my work, in being that sort of disagreeable with a purpose, as opposed to kind of disagreeable personally. Randy, what about you?
So I like to read lots of books at the same time. And one of the books that I'm rereading, probably for the third or fourth time, is Dark Horse by Todd Rose, and this idea of how do we define success. And I think that's what that question, that curiosity, drew me back to reread this again. And I think that it's the kind of book that when you reread it, you uncover other layers that you didn't see previously. And it's this idea of follow the path that is the fit for you. He talks about this idea of knowing what your micro motives are and finding the fit in your work to those micro motives. But the what he calls the standardization covenant compels us to actually go for the climb the ladder of success, basically buying into that narrative that society tells you that, go for the status, go for the wealth, and then you'll be fulfilled. But usually we're finding that doesn't necessarily happen. But the curiosity that's come from this, and I think I actually texted this question to both of you at some point during the week, is how do we translate his three prongs of know your micro motives, know your choices, know your strategies, to something that's actually like workable in education? Like, I'm starting to believe in this idea that it really is about fit. If we can get our kids self-aware enough to understand what are their micro motives, not their motives, what are their micro motives, which requires a far more refined and intense sense of self-awareness. If we can get them to understand those micro motives, we can have them pursue a pathway that is a fit for them, as opposed to a fit for what the school or their parents or society is telling them to do. And then what would the world be like if we had the majority of people in a space where they're a fit as opposed to where they were told to go?
So it's interesting, Randy. One of the things I connected to what you just shared is the real challenge right now for a lot of educators are having with kids in classrooms where kids are not quote unquote behaving. And I'm sure that there is, I don't believe in the polarized way of thinking it's all or none. There are definitely kids who, can benefit from structure, right? So I think that to understand one's micromotives, there are some who need a defined structure, and there are those who perhaps need some looser guardrails. But to your point about micromotives, there are definitely kids who during the pandemic realized that having a sense of agency and having a sense of self-direction was a better fit for their learning style than what currently happens in many classrooms. And so I will say I immediately, when you started sharing about micromotives again, it got me thinking about how perhaps some of the rub we're feeling in some classrooms with some kids is around the micromotive of agency and well, I don't think agency is a micromotive, let me be very clear, but around self-direction perhaps as a micromotive. I'll share that I'm reading Todd Rose, although I'm reading his newest book, Collective Illusions, right now. And the thing that I have loved about the first 4 to 5 chapters of the book, he's focusing on the psychology of why we conform. So if you think of our first compass point is, about shifting from compliance to active curiosity. And I think that conformity and groupthink are really kind of the antithesis of what we're trying to get people to do. And it doesn't mean that you don't eventually go along with the crowd, but I have been thinking quite a bit about why. So Randy talks a lot about how we all have this kind of hidden story or this hidden secret that we just don't want to admit, which is that, school doesn't really work for most people. That there are time and places where the traditional system was, we were successful living in it and working within it, but we all kind of have this like hidden thing that we know. And I've been thinking a lot about that as I read. The thing that I connected to this week that I did want to share though was when we had a chance to listen to Olka Joshi Hansen, who wrote The Future of Smart. There was this really interesting statement she made, which is there's some disagreement on the use of human-centered versus humanity-centered learning environments. And I always find it fascinating when people argue and debate semantics, but I think this is one that's really critical because, as I alluded to in another conversation, the tendency is to focus on the system or to focus on the self and not to see the self as the catalyst for change within the system. And I think intentionally using human-centered presents a situation where we focus on ourselves, on our own growth, on our own change, on our own mind shifts that then inform the system itself. And so it's both happening at the same time. But I thought that was a really interesting conversation. And there were some in the group who really believed it should be humanity-centered because the ultimate goal should be about improving humanity. I don't philosophically disagree with that as an outcome, but I think when you start with that as the goal, it allows people to not examine themselves. To me, human-centered learning is about an examination of the self. And again, this connects directly back to Randy's perspective on micromotives. If we allow our kids to understand who they are, then it's more likely that they can find the right fit in a career or in their life together. So I'll leave with my commitment and I'll pass it back to Randy. My commitment this week is to continue to read Collective Illusions and look for some connections between their work, Todd Rose's work, which we love, and our work.
Oh, related to my commitment, I failed at my commitment this week. I did not write. This will come out later, but the site is launching on Monday, so a lot of the time has been spent on tying up all the loose ends on that. So I will commit to writing something that can get posted up on the Learning Hub soon.
I'm going to keep reading Think Again and thinking about how to encourage people around us to be objectors and feel more comfortable objecting within the system. So we wanted to thank you for learning alongside us for this edition of Inside the Human School, where our goal is to learn in public and share a little bit about how we're learning and intend to learn more in the future. The Human School. By placing humanity at the center of all design, the Human School seeks to share an evolving story of learning and its impact on the world. Visit thehuman.school and its Learning in Public Hub for additional resources and to join a community committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. You can also follow us on social media. We can't wait to hear how you are intentionally placing humanity at the center. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.